It's lovely to be back with you again, and for this final time to be sharing a bit of the Lenten journey. And this will be obviously the last of the five addresses. You recall that the overall title was Life Stories, 5 questions that are raised from the Gospel of John. And I have to say, I've even been surprised myself in researching for these addresses, just how many questions there are in this gospel. Is just packed with questions. Every chapter is, I hadn't actually realized quite how much this is John's strategy to flood us with questions that he wants us to ask, questions that he wants his own church to ask, because he's writing. Even when he's making a statement, he tends to do it as a question. You know, we are not blind, are we? Could this be the Messiah? It's really quite incredible. And today's the overall question. There's one overall question, and today I suppose we're getting to that a little more closely. The overall question is, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And our question for today, taken from the text, because obviously it doesn't just say who is Jesus in the text, but who is this Son of Man? Who is this Son of Man? But as in each case, we begin with a life story from contemporary experience. And about an hour's drive from Charles de Gaulle Airport is the village of Trolly-Bray. It was there that the very first L'Arche community was formed in 1964. And for those unfamiliar with L'Arche communities, they're communities that were set up in response to what were perceived as being the inhumane conditions of large institutions where people with intellectual difficulties had been routinely placed. Intellectual difficulties might sound like a bit of a euphemism, because back in the day, these were people who were extremely mentally disabled. The founder was a French-Canadian philosopher and theologian called Jean Vanier, who has written extensively and very movingly about the Christian concept of community. He died in 2019, but unfortunately, really, since his death, a second life of sexual abuse with nuns and other workers has come to light. And ruined his reputation, really, as a man. But his work and his writings do also provide more positive testimony, and I think will stand the test of time. Now, there are 150 residential L'Arche communities in 38 countries on 5 continents. And in 1971, a non-residential offshoot was born as a result of a pilgrimage to Lourdes. And this was called Faith and Light. It encouraged communities to form in local, non-residential settings, in parishes, comprising family and friends, as well as the intellectually impaired. And a parish, of which I was once vicar, began the first ecumenical Faith and Light community in Wales, which is one of the reasons why I'm so familiar with it. I was able actually to visit Trolly-Bray in the 90s and to see its work, and indeed to interview Jean Vanier. It was and is a complete village with houses that form small communities of people with intellectual disabilities and volunteer assistance, or assistants. The idea is that we all have disabilities. Some are just more obvious than others. So these assistants may be people who are recovering from trauma, recovering alcoholics, drug users, people like that, or just people wanting to experience life more widely and doing something like this as a gap period. I shall never forget the first lunchtime I experienced. It was summer, so we ate outside one of the houses. The collection of people around the table included assistants and the intellectually disabled, some with very severe disabilities indeed, unable to verbalize or to coordinate their movements. Soon there was food everywhere, but the atmosphere was happy and relaxed. What to many people would be considered bizarre had been normalized. The motto, living, working, learning, and celebrating together in communities of belonging, was being lived out. And actually, I'm not alone in that response. There's a wonderful book called Encounter with Mystery, which is edited by Frances Young, who herself has a severely disabled son. It's a book in which several leading theologians experience the large communities and then write theological reflections about their experience, all of which are incredibly positive, moving, and very helpful. I can think of nowhere better to experience the topsy-turvy world view of Christians than this place. Truly, the least are greatest, the first are last, and the greatest honour is shown to those for whom the world in general has little regard. When such an experience is translated to the written word, it presents itself as irony. Pictures of the so-called great and important are written in a way that enables the reader to see them as insignificant and pathetic. Throughout the Bible, there are several places where we can see irony at work, but the Passion narrative of John is surely one place to see irony employed at its most effective, as the Gospel writer seeks to answer his most basic question, who is Jesus? As ever, John draws us into a conversation, a debate, and challenges us to answer a question for ourselves. And in the Passion narrative, that question concerns Jesus as a king. Now, of course, we're familiar throughout the Synoptic Gospels with the term kingdom of God. According to the first to be published, Mark, it is indeed what the good news is all about. It's what John's and Jesus's proclamation is all about. And this corresponds to the hopes of a Jewish population raised in the culture of apocalyptic writing, that there would be a new age and a new divine oversight, like that in the popular reimagination of the reign of David, which at the time was now seen as one of peace and unity and justice. It's amazing what 1,000 years can do for somebody's reputation. And one which truly honoured the covenant. The first three gospel writers see Jesus as inaugurating this new age, and using the political authority language of their time and culture, they call it a kingdom. To us, that sounds like a place. What they're actually referring to is something more relational. They hope for the kingship of God. They look for a time and a situation in which God's authority is supreme, and when the shabby politics, power struggles, fake truth, and aggression of popular contemporary experience is replaced with justice, truth, mercy, and love, the four main technical terms used in descriptions of the covenant. Again, in popular expectations, some elements in society see this as a political change in real time. This is in Jesus' own time, and indeed in John's own time, sort of an accompaniment to a kind of Romans out movement, because it's an occupied country. That's the context in which Jesus lives. It's not exactly the context in which John writes, but the problems of relations between church and state and between the Christian community and the Jewish religious establishment are very real for John, as we can see also for the wider religious community in the area in which he's writing, which we can see from the book of Revelation, also written to more or less the same area in all probability, and also written around the end of the 1st century in all probability, and indeed in many writings available to us from the beginning of the 2nd century. The Jewish context has also changed, because in AD 70 their temple was all but destroyed and religion had become synagogue based. Their own relations with the Roman occupying and colonial power are very delicate. And it's in this context that John writes an account based on events in Jesus' lifetime that he believes have continuing and universal relevance for the church in his own time. He's quite open about his writing from a post-resurrection standpoint, and he uses the familiar "they didn't understand this at the time, but later they did" kind of interjection to describe that. John rarely uses the word kingdom. According to one estimate, Matthew uses it 54 times, Luke uses it 43, and John uses it just 3 times. He centers his interest on Jesus as king. And that's how he comes to pose questions for us, his readers, with his use of irony in the Passion narrative. He also uses the term to distinguish between earthly and heavenly authority, both in the interrogation by Pilate and in the feeding chapter 6, where Jesus withdraws when the people want to make Jesus a political king. In the gospel, that's not the first mention of Jesus as king. In the very important first chapter, where so many themes are introduced, Nathanael hails him as the Son of God and the King of Israel. Then dismisses the grounds on which Nathanael has made this claim and says, "You will see greater things than that. You will see heaven wide open and God's angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And that sounds to me almost like the dust cover of the book, doesn't it? The sort of thing that you pick up a book and look at the back cover and see what it's going to be about. You will see greater things than that. You'll see heaven wide open, God's angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. A possible reference to Jacob and his ladder. This is the first mention in the Gospel of the title Son of Man. As in the other Gospels, this is the only title that Jesus uses of himself. And in John, he uses it very sparingly, just 12 times, in fact, as opposed to Luke and Matthew, who use it almost 30 times each. There are three characteristic ideas which are attached to John's use of Son of Man. One is being lifted up. This idea is introduced early in the Gospel in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, where he says, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And that's a reference to an account in Exodus, an account of the Exodus in Numbers 21, verses 4 to 9. And in that account, the people are dying of snake bites. And Moses is told to put an image of a snake on a standard and hold it up so that it could be easily seen. Anyone bitten by a snake could then look at this snake and they would live. So the snake, which is in any case an image of immortality, because it can completely change its skin and still be alive. And you see it often in medically related organizations' logos. The snake is for the people an image of healing and resurrection. When Jesus speaks of being lifted up, as he does again at chapter 8, verse 28, he uses the image to refer to his crucifixion, where he will literally be lifted up. And this passage concludes with the usual clamour of voices and questions. When I am lifted up from the earth, says Jesus, I shall draw everyone to myself. And people say, what do you mean by saying the Son of Man must be lifted up? What Son of Man is this? Our question for today. The second series of occurrences is in relation to the Eucharist in chapter 6. The Son of Man there is the source of eternal life, and we share in that life by eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And that's a passage we've already looked at in detail. The third idea is that of being glorified. This is a royal allusion and is often associated with a particular time at which this glorification will happen, which he refers to as my time or my hour. At 12:23, Jesus says that the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. At 13:31, when he can speak to the true disciples after Judas had left at the Last Supper, again, Jesus announces that this is the hour to be glorified. For John, the cross is a throne. Everything that is divine in him meets with everything that is human on that throne. It's also symbolically a place that gives him a particular perspective. It's a throne from which, within a kingdom not of this world, he can survey the world. Now, the question, what Son of Man is this, is one that's exercised scholars for centuries, because it's an ambiguous term. In Hebrew, there are very few adjectives. There are just a few very basic ones, like adjectives for good and bad. If you want to say that someone, for example, is a righteous man, you'd have to say that he is a son of righteousness. If you want to say that someone is, in every sense, exactly like David, you would have to say that he is a son of David. So to say that someone is a son of man can simply mean man, someone fully human. However, the Son of Man title also had a special place in the scheme of Jewish expectation that I've described, Jewish apocalyptic. He would be the one who presented to God for vindication those who had remained faithful to God in troubled times. And this is based on the evidence of Daniel 7:13, which is quoted and alluded to throughout the New Testament. One like a son of man comes to the Ancient of Days on the clouds of heaven, bringing with him those who will be rewarded for their faithfulness. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, quotes this verse just before he dies, and you can see why that should be so. And indeed, in Mark's version of Pilate's interrogation of Jesus, Jesus himself quotes it. Together with the newfound belief in resurrection of the dead, it clearly encompasses a version of Christian hope. Alongside the Son of Man, the other key player in this drama of contemporary expectation was the person anointed like David had been. The Hebrew for that, of course, is Messiah, and in Greek, Christos, who would variously inaugurate the kingdom, or according to some traditions, lead the faithful in battle against malign powers to bring the kingdom into being. These expectations give us the terms Son of David and Messiah, which are common also in the New Testament. In the all-important chapter 1 of the Gospel, John has Nathanael say, "We have found the Messiah." And the Samaritan woman in chapter 4 is similarly convinced, though, as I've said, typically for John, her statement is expressed as a question. Could this be the Messiah? There's a cluster of occurrences of the title in chapter 7, where there's a general chunter about the meaning of the term Messiah and whether Jesus could meet the expectation. John is anxious to strip the gospel of its Jewish apocalyptic trappings, but still to use terms that would be familiar to Jews who had become Christians. And indeed, in his statement of intention for the gospel, he says in chapter 20 that the gospel is written in order that you believe that Jesus is the Christ, Christos. Nevertheless, king is his chosen and arguably most effective word as he describes Jesus' passion, which also is instructive in the wider question of who Jesus is, because it lends itself to irony as the power of God is contrasted with political and institutional power. Each of the Gospels alludes to Jesus as a king when he enters Jerusalem for the last time on a donkey, which we remember from this morning, and each quotes from Psalm 118. But only John adds, "Blessed is the King of Israel." Only he is really definite about the identity of Jesus there. Each of the Gospels also records Pilate's opening words to Jesus as he examines him. "Are you the King of the Jews?" But only John takes this picture as the central theme of Pilate's questioning. The only word Pilate uses to address Jesus is king, and he uses it all the time. He used it about half a dozen times. Pilate is clearly having difficulty getting his head around whether Jesus is a king or not, or perhaps just claiming to be. And Pilate has similar difficulty with the idea of truth. As readers, we know that Jesus certainly claims to be the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And he tells Pilate that his task is to witness to the truth. And we can almost hear Pilate sigh as he says, what is truth? But that is also the question for the reader. It's a passage that raises the question of authority. Let me quote from it. Do you refuse to speak to me, Pilate said. Don't you realize I have authority either to free you or crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Further irony is added by Pilate's statement to the crowd, here is the man, which only John records, ecce homo, especially if we understand by Son of Man that truly human sense, that definitive sense of being human. In other words, this is what it means to be truly human. And just imagine that picture of this pathetic looking figure who's been humiliated and degraded and dehumanized, but nevertheless dressed in purple clothes and all the rest of it. This is what it means to be truly human, full of irony. Pilate is reluctant to proceed to a death sentence. And so, like the other Gospels, we see the mocking of Jesus in its description, again full of irony, highlighting the difference between secular and faith-based ideas of power and authority. The one based on crowns, robes, and agency, and the other based on truth, vulnerability, and witness. The ironic climax comes in chapter 19, verse 13. Pilate brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench, it says. In Greek, there's an ambiguity here concerning the verb sat. It could mean Pilate sat on the bench as judge, but it could also mean that Pilate sat Jesus on the bench. And that's an ambiguity that would not be lost on the initial readers. Who is judging whom? Who is the real authority here? In the end, Pilate seemingly decides about Jesus' integrity and who he really is, in the words of the inscription that placed on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And his response to the objections that he should have put, this man said, I am the King of the Jews, was, what I have written, I have written. But the irony is that he doesn't really know the significance of anything that he's either done or said or written. Clearly, there's a fantastic amount to talk about within this whole trial scene, this whole run up to the crucifixion, and no doubt during the week you'll hear much more about it, not least from the bishop himself. Who is this Son of Man? Was our question. A further twist is added when we read the story in John of the first Easter morning, actually, because John's is the only gospel to mention that Jesus was buried in a garden, which is normally where kings are buried. And when Mary of Magdala sees him, she mistakenly believes he is the gardener. Are we meant perhaps to be reminded of the story of another garden? In the beginning, in Genesis 2, we hear that God planted a garden and that he put the man there to till it and look after it. In other words, to be a gardener. And it's in that setting that John kind of repeats the question that began the gospel. But not now, what are you looking for, but who are you looking for? Is this the new beginning, the new creation that we've been anticipating from the start of the book? So who is this Son of Man? He is, for John, true man. He is the first man, as he is described elsewhere, the first fruits of creation and a second Adam. He's the inheritor of the religious tradition's descriptions of God as truth and way and shepherd and resurrection and life. He's foot-washing servant and king. He loves the world, but is its judge. As we reflect on Jesus' last words from the cross, the most significant of those is when he sees his mother there and says, Mother, there is your son, and says to the disciple, there is your mother. And perhaps I can leave you with two quotations that give a sense of how those words kind of connect with us today. The first is from the latest substantial commentary on John by the Cambridge professor David Ford. He says this, Jesus being lifted up on the cross is essential to the core message of the gospel about the love of God for the world and his only son being given for the salvation of the world. It's also the decisive revelation of who Jesus is. As he said, then you will realize that I am, and when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. Now that lifting up has finally happened, these first words Jesus speaks from that position unite a new community of those drawn to the cross. And the other quote is from where we began today, from Jean Vanier. Then Jesus is nailed to the cross. And what does he do from there? He forms a community. When he sees his mother and the disciple he loved at the foot of the cross, he says to his mother, Woman, here is your son, and to the disciple, here is your mother. Then John says that the disciple took her into his home. So out of the depths of humiliation, Jesus creates a community. At the heart, the root of this community is the humiliated one. That tells us an awful lot about John's sense of irony and about Jesus as king. The community that Jean Vanier speaks about and John speaks about is the community of which 2,000 years later we are a part. Thank you.